Writing a grant is like writing a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Where your story really begins is with your program title. Make certain to use a title that explains what your program is. Then take a moment to introduce yourself to us. Please tell us who you are and why you do the work you do so that we'll understand why you're asking for this grant. If we don't understand the connection between your organization and the program for which you're requesting funding, we're going to question the reason why you're applying for it. In other words, if a church-based food pantry wants a grant to teach computer coding, that would make us scratch our heads and go, unless you make it clear to us. Remember that committee members read and score the grant applications, and your organization may be one that they aren't that familiar with. Use this space to highlight the purpose of your organization. The program description is where you start writing your story. And please note, you'll have a certain number of characters in which to summarize what your program is. Now here's a tip. After you write your description, we suggest you try it out along with your program title on somebody who's not that familiar with it. Then ask yourself, do they have a basic grasp of what the program is? And does it sound like it's an exciting program to them? If the answer to either of these questions is no, well, then you have more work to do. One other thing about those character counts, remember, character counts are your friends. We know it can be frustrating to have to keep pruning your narrative and stay within the count. But here's the good news. It'll force you to keep refining and clarifying your story. And that's important because typically our grant readers will read and score 8 to 30 grants each session. So it's best to keep your story clear and powerful. Before you go to the meat of your story, we need to get some additional specific items from you, like your program start and end date, for example, and other information we need for our database.
Now you're at the middle of your story. This section is called Program Impact. Here you're going to want to think about what changed as a result of your grant program. What does it look like? How will it work? Some tips for you. Try not to repeat information that you've told us already, maybe in a different section. You're also going to want to take a look at your program description and make sure you're expanding upon it meaningfully. Lastly, take out everything that isn't essential for grant readers to understand what you're doing and why. For the outcomes section, we're asking you what you hope to accomplish with your program. Think of it this way. What did your clients experience before your program? We'll call that X. After your program, now they experience Y. The difference between X and Y is your outcome. An example might be increased healthy food consumption in a low-income population, or more York County 3- and 4-year-olds enrolled in early childhood education. Indicators are what we use to recognize the difference in experience. These are measurable statistics to prove your outcome. In the examples I just gave, that might be increased healthy food consumption rose 25%, or early childhood education enrollment increased by 10%. Your method of measurement is really where you got those numbers from. So in the healthy food example, maybe it's food logs or one-on-one assessment. Early childhood ed example is enrollment records that you're looking at. Unclear or hard to measure indicators really makes it hard for grant readers to know your program's potential for success. There are funds we have that where we might ask you to impact pretty specific indicators that are predefined. Competitive impact or partnership grants, you're going to want to check with Community Foundation staff and the website to make sure that your program aligns with these predefined indicators. Here are a few tips on measurement. Be creative here. Try to think broadly. Are pre- and post-testing the best way to measure change? Is there something else? What are the best ways to quantify your work that demonstrates your program is changing your clients' lives? We do understand that programs are works in progress. You may not achieve the outcomes you expected, and that's okay. We ask that you use what you are learning and share that with us. It's going to make your program better and us better funders so that we can learn with you.
Now it's time to wrap up the story. Your statement of need is where you tell our grant readers about your target audience. How did you identify the problem or community need that your program will address? what data supports this. Please be sure to cite your data sources. Finally, tell us why you're the right organization to receive funding for this program. What's unique about your expertise and your capacity to take this program on? Don't breathe a sigh of relief quite yet. There's another way you're going to tell your story. Your program budget. It's really your program summary in numbers. Here are the program costs, and here's what we will pay for ourselves. Do you have program fees? Great. Show them to us. Do you have a public funding source or donor underwriting? Show that too. Then show us what you need from us to close this gap. Here are some tips. Return to the beginning of the grant to be absolutely sure that the total of what you ask from us in your final budget matches what you asked for in the beginning of the grant. We often see a mismatch, especially when there's a lot of different hands involved in writing the grant. Ask yourself whether you're asking the right amount of money from us as opposed to your other sources of funding. Try to think like a grant reader who doesn't know your program. What would we think of your commitment to a program if you're asking us to fund 100% of the program? Is the amount you're requesting in scale with the number of people to be served? So, for example, if you're asking for $10,000 to serve 10 people, does the $1,000 per person ratio align with the impact of the program? And how will you sustain your program after it's funded? This is trickier than it sounds. Often it's the last thing a grant writer thinks about, but you'll probably want to think this through before applying. We've seen some really good answers to this question. For example, you're piloting a program to prove its value to a market that will then pay for it in the future. This could include, for example, a program that schools might purchase once you've been able to demonstrate its impact, or that folks will pay for once they've seen how great it is, or it might attract public funding once you've demonstrated how your program cuts costs in other publicly funded areas. Or maybe you're asking for seed funding from us that will allow you to apply for another funding stream once you take your program to the next level. Sometimes answers to the sustainability question are not quite as good. For example, when you say you'll fund it yourself in the future, we wonder why you need funding from us to kick it off. When you say that you'll increase your fundraising in the future to pay for this, we wonder why you don't just do that now. And if public funding is going to be available next year for the program, we wonder, why don't you just wait another year to do your program?
At this point, you're almost done with your grant application. But before hitting submit, we want you to reflect on what else can be included to help strengthen your case for support. What else will provide the grant readers confidence that this is going to be a successful and impactful program? Here are some tips. If your narrative says you are going to partner with an agency in a new way, or you are offering a program that others will want to purchase, then include letters of support from these organizations. Make certain that these letters indicate their commitment and excitement for partnering with you. More often than not, the letters that accompany our grant request are exact replicas of each other and don't state the partner's specific role in the grant program. Break the mold. Ask your partners to take time to personalize their letters of support. It's hard to read excitement from cut and paste support letters. In addition to the support letters, we also ask you to include drawings, blueprints, or any other documents that would help readers imagine your idea. Upload those as well.
So, you're ready to submit your application. Before you press that button, here are a few tips. Spell check and grammar check your application. Be sure that you have defined any acronyms or field distinct terms. Ask a colleague to read your application. Do they understand what you're requesting funding for? Remember, each part of the grant is important. The title of your grant program, the outcomes, the program sustainability, the budget, and the letters of support. A well-written application will give grant readers the confidence that you have a great program and that your nonprofit is the right organization to run that program. Congratulations, you've submitted your grant application. At this time, staff is reading your application at a minimum of 2 times. Sometimes we will email you questions that we think will help clarify your grant request. Once we receive the answers to our questions, we assign your grant application to volunteer grant readers. They will score your application. Grant readers will use this rubric available on our website to rank each grant. The grants are then discussed at a committee meeting to decide which grants will be funded. Lastly, the slate of grants that the committee voted on to fund goes before the respective boards for final approval. Whether or not your grant is selected for funding, you'll be notified shortly after the board's vote. If your grant was selected for funding, we'll arrange for you to sign your grant contract. By signing the grant contract, you are confirming that your nonprofit will use the grant funds as proposed in your application, will look for opportunities to tell the world about your great work, and stay in touch for the course of your program. This is really important to us. We are looking forward to working together and learning about best practices that work and learning about what doesn't work as well. If your grant is not selected for funding, we really hope that you will reach out to us to learn why. We'll share with you what the grant readers had to say about your grant and provide you with suggestions that you may want to consider when you apply in the future. This is really the time to start planning how your nonprofit will apply for the next competitive grant cycle and to use us as a resource as you move through this process.